Welcome to another episode of that Grief Relief podcast. My name is Katie, and this week I'm joined by a lady from Cork, just south of Cork, we discovered, in Ireland. Hello, Jody. How are you?
Hi, I'm really well, thank you. West Cork, the Republic of West Cork, as it's sometimes called.
Right, okay. But you don't sound like you're from the Republic of West Cork.
I'm not. I'm a London girl. I'm actually genetically half Irish.
Okay.
But born and brought up in the UK.
Okay.
And now I've been living here for a few years, and I'm what's known here as a blow-in.
Right, okay. And is that a foreigner, or is that a term for an English person in Ireland?
To be honest, it can be someone from the next valley, but it can also, it's most often used for kind of non-Irish people who've settled here.
Right. Jody, you've been very kind. I reached out to you on Instagram because how do I word this actually? I reached out to you on Instagram because of the wonderful work you do with Gateway Women. And I won't introduce it. I won't explain it. So I'll hand over to you if you can let me know what you do and what is Gateway Women all about.
Damn, I thought you'd do this bit for me.
No, I'm afraid not. Who's going to explain it better than you?
Okay, so Gateway Women it started as a blog 10 years ago this year. I was struggling to come to terms with the fact that I wasn't a mum when that had been a big dream of mine. And I was trying to talk to people about it, and no one would let me discuss it. They would all shut me down with what I came to learn were called bingos, which are these kind of short statements where they say, oh, you could have one on your own. Oh, you're still so young. Oh, don't worry, you'll meet someone. Or here, have one of mine. Or, oh gosh, you dodged a bullet there by not having kids. Or, oh, our kids aren't all they're cracked up to be. These kind of extraordinary, short, totally empathy-free statements that actually even some of the most empathic people can trot out that just kind of, shut you down. And it means we're not going there in this conversation. And I realized that, I consulted Dr. Google, therapists. No one seemed to have any help for me. And I'm a writer. So I had been blogging for a few years on a sort of personal blog. And I thought, I'm going to start writing about this. And so I started a blog called Gateway Women. Within the day after my first blog, I got my first piece of PR. Extraordinary.
Really?
Women from all over the world were, blogs were big news a decade ago. Now it's like, a blog, what's that? It was a big thing. Yeah. Back in the olden days. And women from all over the world were commenting on my blog. And then it kind of got picked up by a journalist who came to a talk that I gave and wrote an article about me that came out in The Guardian in early 2012 that went kind of viral. And it is still being read and shared, called I May Not Be a Mother, But I'm Still a Person. And really it kind of just sort of took off. I was training to be a psychotherapist, and on the side I was continuing to write my blog, continuing to talk. A little bit like you, it was something from my personal experience that I started being open about. And suddenly it's like the world leaned in and went, oh yeah, me too.
Yeah.
And here we are 10 years later. It's now the best known and most trusted resource for involuntary childless women in the English-speaking world. It has a sort of a social reach of around 2 million. Wow. There is my best-selling book, Living the
Life Unexpected. Okay.
Living the Life Unexpected, How to Find Hope, Meaning and a Fulfilling Future Without Children. I'd love to read you a little bit from that later, if that's appropriate.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And we run workshops. We have an amazing online community. We have social meetups all over the world. They're a little bit sort of on pause during the pandemic. Many of them have gone online, and a lot of them are just sort of resting. But at one point, we had 100 free social meetups around the world and across all the continents. Wow. And it's quite extraordinary. I've given a TED talk. I've been called the patron saint of childlessness. More recently, and perhaps more memorably, the Beyonce of childlessness. But I have neither the moves nor the outfits. So, but I'm taking it.
Absolutely, yeah, claim that for sure.
And it's extraordinary. It's been an amazing journey for me. I'm now a qualified psychotherapist. I run Gateway Women. And I have an amazing team that work with me. And now it's about moving forwards and also into the next part of the journey for me. I'll be 57 this week. And the next
Happy
part of the
birthday.
journey is becoming what I call a conscious, childless elder woman. And
Okay.
this is really for, I think, for all women without children, however you arrived at that. As we get older in our culture, there is no word of respect for older women other than grandmother. So I think there's a big piece of work to be done socially in the culture to change the thinking around that, but also to support women who find themselves in elderhood without grandchildren. And perhaps that can be the moment when their grief really gets triggered, because it often comes back for a second pass at that point, which can really knock the ground out from underneath people.
Yeah, because the whole grandparent thing is always interesting, isn't it? I was, and I know that we've touched on this briefly because I don't have children, and that's not what I want in my life. And my parents were never those parents that wanted us to have children. However, I know that is actually the exception as opposed to the rule. You know that women or men of a certain age, they want grandchildren, and I understand that it's, you know, having that love and everything without that the ultimate responsibility. But I'd never thought about it in terms of, you know, childless people, and then getting to that stage in their life where I guess friends in your social circle are becoming grandparents.
It's just, it hasn't quite happened yet. I have a couple of nieces who've had children recently, so I'm a kind of a great aunt, which
Okay.
is rather lovely. I don't have any siblings, so it's sort of it's like my nieces and nephews are I kind of, they're from my ex-marriage, my
Right.
ex-husband,
Yeah.
and that's kind of really special because they're sort of chosen. But none of my peers are yet kind of really grandparents. I think I'm in that sweet spot
Okay.
between all of the kids leaving home and going to university and launching into life and gradually settling down and getting married. And I know from, the women who are in my community who are my age or older, a lot of your friendships come back because there is what I call the hashtag friendship apocalypse of childlessness. I mean,
Okay.
I lost every single one of my friends to parenthood. I
Yeah.
was the only one who didn't have children. I had a couple of child-free friends, which is kind of more commonly used to describe, for example, your situation where you've chosen not to be a parent,
Correct.
but
Yeah.
they'd got what they wanted. They didn't want to be mums, and they weren't.
Yeah.
And then everyone else who wanted to be mums was.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of left sort of marooned on
In the
Spinster
middle.
Island, as I think
Yeah.
of it. Having
Sorry,
got divorced.
I shouldn't laugh, but
And everyone was busy, and I was grieving.
Mm,
And it was incredibly hard. And I think as you then get older and some of those friendships come back, not all of them, but some of them come back, it's then you're just getting settled into, enjoying having your peer group around you again. And then many of them disappear into grandparenthood. They kind of just become sort of obsessed with their grandchildren in the way they were obsessed with their children. And
yeah,
I think it's very natural. And I don't want that to sound like a criticism. I'm pretty sure I would have been exactly the same.
for sure. Yeah.
I'm sure I would have bored for Britain about my children, had them all in the mini Bodon catalogue, changed my profile picture on Facebook to my kids' picture and, just bombarded everyone. I think I would have been an empathy-free zone for childless women because I was so desperate for
Really.
the identity of motherhood. I think I just would have gone into it full pelt. So I understand how it happens, but we hear less about what it's like for those women and men who get left out of that. Because, I mean, you type in something like anything to do with parenting into the internet and it practically breaks it. But childlessness, not so much.
Yeah.
Still, when you consider 1 in 5 women is turning 45, an average of 1 in 5 in the developed world is turning 45 without children, and that only 6 to 10% of those are child-free by choice, that's an awful lot of people, an awful lot of women. The numbers are roughly similar for men who are childless not by choice.
Yeah.
But we don't hear about their stories. We do hear more about the child-free choice now, which is great.
Yeah.
That is becoming definitely less stigmatized. And for women your age, the sort of the elderly millennials, as you're apparently known as.
I am.
You're welcome.
I born in 1981. I am literally the first millennial.
Yeah, you're the elderly millennials. You're welcome. Is as they are moving into their 40s, I think we're seeing early indications on data and statistics would suggest there will be a much higher proportion of both voluntary childlessness, child-free, and involuntary, because also your generation has lived through two massive global downturns. So there are
Yeah.
there are also lots of structural things around family building and partnering that have been torpedoed
Yeah,
through your
absolutely.
20s and 30s.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you're right. It is, and not to talk about my story over yours, but yes, certainly, people are coming more to terms with, say, women wanting career over family, or what have you. I, however, live in the Middle East, and
Yes.
that's just not a thing. And I'll give you a true example. I went to see my doctor the other day, and she said, "Do you have children?" I said, "No." And she said, "Are you planning to have children?" I said, "No." And she was like, "Oh, well, why?" And I was like, and I always try and make not a joke out of it, but kind of lightheartedness of it, because I don't want to enter into this conversation, but without disrespecting her cultural decision or whatever. And I just say, "Oh no, they're not my cup of tea," and that's what I leave it. And then she goes, "Oh, just have one," and I'm like, "No, no, it's okay." So anyway, and as you can imagine, it's a huge thing culturally here. But that's voluntary childlessness, if that's the terminology that we're using. But obviously for you it was involuntary. So tell me your story, because that's exactly what you've said, wanting to share your story, and hopefully this is an additional platform for you to share that.
Thank you. Um, and it's interesting how just have one. That's an extraordinary
Just
response.
that one. She
And
actually
in a way,
followed it up
that
with, "You
may
don't
well
need..."
be one of the bingos that, because child-free women also get a series of bingos. Probably the most common one is "You'll change your mind." I mean, I can't imagine how many times yes, I could tell by your face you've heard that one. But maybe just have one is another one of those.
Yeah.
It's like,
And again, bearing in mind I live in Dubai, she did back it up with, because I said, and this is a very genuine reason, again, sorry about me, is that, it's the world's toughest job, hands down, the world's hardest job. I don't believe I'm cut out for it, and I don't want to be cut out for it. I like doing what I want when I want, and leaving the house when I want, etc., etc. And I said this to her. I said, it's a huge responsibility. I don't think I should be responsible for an animal, let alone a child. And she said, "Oh, you can just get a maid." And I thought, this isn't a conversation that's going to go very far, is it? I changed doctors. It was fine. I can't be doing with that every time I need to go and see her. So
yeah. And women who are childless sort of experience exactly the same comments in sort of gynecologists and doctor's office, with people who don't sort of understand that all of those options are closed for them.
yeah, and that's what I was going
Like,
to
why
say.
don't you just adopt? It's like as if it's never occurred to you, or you
Yeah.
haven't looked into it, or you haven't tried, or there are very, very very personal reasons why that's not an option for you.
Yeah. And
It's
that's what I was going to ask you, actually, is in terms of, I guess, because in theory, she wouldn't have known. It was the first time I'd met her as a GP. She wouldn't have known why I don't have children, or I don't want
absolutely.
children. So I guess that's something that you must have faced time and time again. Like, and how do you deal with that? Do you just go straight up and go, "Well, actually, X, Y, Z," or do you just try and avoid the conversation because it's not worth it?
It varies,
Mm,
and it varies enormously depending on where you are in your grief. When you're
for sure.
raw in your grief and someone asks you that question and then gives you their opinion about what you should do about it, and this can be anything from a doctor or to a complete stranger or to a job interview or, anywhere. Suddenly, the world has an opinion about your uterus and what you should be doing with it, and they've got the answer. you know, is when you're really grieving, it's too painful.
Yeah.
You often feel attacked. You might just do everything you can to get out of there, or you might be quite angry and get into a bit of a situation because as you know, anger is part of grief.
Yeah.
So I think in the early days, sometimes I would try to educate people. Sometimes I would try to defend myself. I would get quite defensive. Sometimes I would just try and get out of there. But as I kind of healed through the grief process and started also to understand the social and systemic issues that underpin these questions, the prejudice against people without children, and how often these people didn't want me to be one of those childless women. That was a quote. You know, you're too lovely to be one of those childless women. You know, we don't want to put you in that camp. We want to rescue
Who
you.
says things like that?
Yeah. I started to develop different answers. And one of the things I recommend to women who are, you know, because I get asked this a lot, you know, how do I deal with all these intrusive questions? I would say you need a range of answers, from funny ones that just kind of diffuse the moment.
Right.
I mean, you know, like at a cocktail party, remember those?
You mean
And
with other
someone would
people?
say, you know, yeah, do you have children? I'd be like, I don't think so. You know what I mean? And then they would kind of laugh, and the moment would pass.
Yeah.
Or to something maybe you realise that it's a social opener. They're actually not trying to trip you up. You can just go sort of like, no, I don't. You know, I'm guessing you do. And you just kind of lob it back to them.
Right. Yeah, great.
If it feels like a teaching moment, you know, which it is, not always. You know, sometimes I might say something like, actually, you know, 1 in 5 women, actually, for my age, 1964, 1 in 4 women my age doesn't have children. Only 10% of those by choice. It's actually a really common situation for women like me. You probably know others like me. You know, it's actually hidden, is it? But it's a really big thing around us these days. And I'll say, maybe you know someone else who doesn't have children who might have wanted them, and the extraordinary thing is, since I started asking that, which was about 3-4 years ago, I haven't met a single person who doesn't know someone impacted by this issue. A friend, a grandchild, a daughter-in-law, a son-in-law, someone at work, a neighbour. They'll kind of think about it and they'll go, oh yeah. And it's like, this is a huge societal issue that we're not talking about. So that's what I mean. You need a range of answers.
Clearly.
And, you know, you can have a few kind of arsey ones in there as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have, you know, I do know, I wouldn't do this one. I'm not quite this person, but I do know someone who says,
I'll get my pen. Hold on.
yeah, that's a fascinating question to ask. I didn't realize we were going to get so intimate so quickly. You know,
That is a great answer.
how much do you weigh? How much do you earn? What's your favorite sexual position?
Yes.
You know, whatever it is, it's like, this is a really personal question, and people need to stop asking it. Let's just go back to talking about the weather. For goodness sake, it's doing enough interesting things these days.
Yeah, let's just talk about COVID. I mean, that's the staple now, right?
Probably. And also, if someone's got kids, particularly a woman, chances are within 2 minutes you'll know. You don't need to ask. You really don't need to ask.
That's a really, really interesting question, a statement, sorry. And as well, backed up with the fact that the amount of pressure, I don't know if this is the right thing to say at the right time, but the amount of pressure that are on people that have had one child, and then it's like, well, when are you having another one? And it's like, well, hold on, I've just given birth to a human being. I'll just wait a while, maybe, for the next one.
This extraordinary kind of public prurient interest in a woman's uterus. I mean, when you do become pregnant and you have a bump, it's like you become public property. You know, people want to talk to you about it. People want to touch it, sometimes even without asking. There's this sense of public ownership. And as you're right, if you have one child, people say, well, it's not fair not to have another one. And it's like, and you are?
Yeah. Sorry, nice to meet you. Who the hell are you? It's fascinating. I mean, we can talk about that for hours and hours. And obviously that's why you're doing this amazing work with Gateway Women. And as you say, it was very interesting. And this was the post that I actually picked up on Instagram with you, was the fact that you, and again, I do want to get into the story if you don't mind. And I know we've spoken about that as to why you haven't had children and couldn't have children and all of that. But then the fact is that I must admit, and I'm sure I do know people, but off the top of my head, I know many women that unfortunately have suffered miscarriages, but yes, they have gone on to have children. And the post that I saw that you said was that hasn't happened for you. And that you're not alone. And so what happens to those women, and where's the support to those women who, yes, you've gone through awful times, but you have this wonderful thing at the end, and you don't. So tell me about that.
Yeah, and the miscarriage narrative. I mean, it's and thank you for doing that podcast with the guy. I can't remember his name now.
Chris Whitfield.
Talking about setting up support for men going through miscarriage with their partners. That is so important. So that is another part of what is called disenfranchised grief. Men's grief around childlessness is kind of disenfranchised. It's not allowed. There's no space for it.
Yeah.
And also, 1 in 4 pregnancies, ends in miscarriage. And 1 in 5 women is ending up without children. For many women, that miscarriage is not followed by what's called a rainbow baby. It's followed by childlessness. Miscarriage can be the end of their family building journey, not sort of a tragic part of it until, perhaps they have a child. But it's this, our society really doesn't like what childlessness represents, which is a lack of agency, a lack of choice, that actually sometimes even the nicest, kindest people with the best data, enough money, who've done all the right things, there's some things in life you can't control. You can't fix, you can't create a happy ending. And this really shakes kind of the idea of our society. In fact, death and grief really shakes the idea that we actually have control over things. And being childless after miscarriage is not a narrative that the miscarriage community wants to think about, even though it's incredibly common. And that's because, in a way, childlessness and childless women, we're the kind of bad fairies at the christening. We're the outcome no one wants. Yeah. People just don't really want, we are, every woman who wants to be a mother, we are their worst dream. They don't want to be us.
No.
They don't want to even think we exist. It's a kind of a very natural human way to kind of just push out of sight what is uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I mean,
for sure.
We represent the death of children, the death of family. It's like, hi, I'm childless. Ooh.
Yeah, yeah. But the fact of the matter is you do exist.
Yeah, but there's an unconscious almost fear of us that maybe our childlessness is catching.
Yeah. No, I can envisage it, yeah.
Yeah. And my story is that when I was growing up, I grew up in a pretty fractured and unhappy home with a mum who had me very young, sort of by accident. So I kind of cut short her sort of groovy 60s teenage years.
Right.
And then she became a young mum. She got married when I was 3 to someone who wasn't my dad because she was under such pressure from family. Sort of Catholic teenage, an unwed mother, Catholic teenager, all very shocking at the time.
Gosh, yeah.
And was in a very unhappy marriage with a child very young. And I grew up in a home where, my mum was really unhappy and motherhood hadn't been her first choice. And also she wasn't really equipped for motherhood. She'd had a really rocky start herself. So it's like, she'd been, when you have a mother who has been unmothered, it was difficult for both of us.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And so I kind of grew up with the idea that, and also it was spoken and unspoken when I was growing up, that having children ruined your life. This was also the message I got at school. It was also the message I got from society. It was, at that time, teenage pregnancies were still a really big thing. They have been massively brought under control now, but it was still a really big thing. And the only sort of sex education we got at school was kind of really about, that getting pregnancy was incredibly easy. You had to be super careful. Don't even sit on a warm seat that a boy's been on. Yeah. It was like it's just, oh my God, I'm going to get pregnant. Yeah. So the kind of really, we grew up with a fear of pregnancy, but also allied to, my growing up years were the 1970s. So, I was a teenager in the 1980s, but my kind of growing up years were the 1970s. I was born in 1964. Being pregnant wasn't groovy then. Being a mum wasn't groovy. If a pop star or a film star got pregnant, they had to kind of drop out of sight. No one wanted to see them pregnant because it really kind of spoilt how cool they were.
How interesting.
And then they didn't necessarily bring their children into the public eye. Their children were kept away from the public eye. So there was this sense that pregnancy was a private, slightly shameful thing that happened behind closed doors, meant you'd been having sex. You just wore a huge maternity smock to kind of hide your bump.
Usually navy with polka dots.
Navy, exactly.
Love a pregnant woman in navy, don't they?
That's sort of 1982. But if we sort of fast forward from, you know, Princess Diana being pregnant in 1982 to Beyonce being pregnant, practically breaking the internet with, you know, a huge and glorious pregnancy bump,
Yep.
and being a sort of fertility goddess, it's pregnancy has gone from being a private family thing to being a public female achievement. The status of pregnancy and motherhood has really changed in my lifetime. Then we also bring in the 1970s that the second wave feminism was really starting to take effect noticeably in women's lives. And there were opportunities coming up for me that my mum hadn't had. And she didn't say, don't have a family and don't get married. But it was like, don't rely on a man, have a career, get your education, see the world. There are so many amazing things for you that she would have loved to have had. So if you imagine, I launched into adult life with all of these messages, and I thought, I'm not going to have children. Because also I thought having children meant having my childhood again. And I was really happy to be launched into the world, you know, on my own.
Yeah.
So much so that when I got pregnant accidentally when I was 20, I was terrified. Absolutely. I was in a lovely relationship with a really nice guy who was like, you know, totally up for getting married and having the baby. And I was just that message, you know, I'm going to follow the path of my mother and my grandmother. I'm going to have a baby lung and I'm going to ruin my life. And I was like, no, I'm not. So I had an abortion. I don't regret it. It was the right thing to do. Looking back now on my 20-year-old self, you know, from being, you know, 57, you know, I was emotionally kind of still the walking wounded from my childhood, carrying a lot of unprocessed trauma that I would have had nowhere to put it except to pass it on to my child, you know, as my mum and my grandmother had no other option other than to do that. I think I would have been a really shit mum at 20. So I didn't regret it. A few years later, I got married to a different guy. I said to him when we were courting, you know, I'm pretty sure I don't want to have children. He was like, okay. You know, we got married. A few years later, I'm 29. I'm beginning. He's part of a big family. He's one of 6.
Okay.
And I saw something different about family that I hadn't seen growing up.
Yeah, I was going to say, much more of a family unit.
Yeah, I thought, okay, doesn't have to be just the way I've experienced it. And I started to realize that having a child wouldn't be having my childhood again. It would be having our child, his and my child, a combination of our genes. And that started to seem delightful. And so I said, actually, I think I do want to have children. And he was like, okay. These 2 huge conversations that can derail relationships. Luckily, they were both fine. So we started trying to have a family when I was 29. And I wasn't able to conceive. I just presumed it would take time. You know, I'd had the abortion. I knew that everything worked. A few years later, I had an operation called a laparoscopy, which is where they sort of stick a camera through your navel and have a look around at everything. And when I came out, the surgeon said to me, finest uterus I've seen all week. You lovely young people just go off and have lots more sex. That was it. That was the fertility advice. And there was nothing wrong. There was nothing wrong structurally. There was nothing, you know, there was no damage. There was nothing wrong with either of our hormones, or there was absolutely no reason why I couldn't conceive that they could see. But I couldn't conceive. And the years went on. I tried everything. I tried every alternative practitioner. You know, I peed on every kind of stick. I stood on my head after sex. I did all kinds of things. I stopped eating things. I changed a job because it was near a road that was very polluted. I force-fed my then husband vitamins. You know, he worked with quite toxic paints. I made him start using non-toxic paint. You know, all kinds of things.
Yeah, literally anything.
Anything. I mean, I could have gone around London just randomly sticking £50 notes through people's doors, you know, sort of any, you know, I mean, shamans, you know, any kind of alternative practitioner that said they could get me pregnant, including some quite sort of serious doctors.
Yeah.
And I followed loads of protocols and nothing happened. And this put a huge amount of pressure on our relationship. He was a kind of very glamorous interior designer, quite sort of fast living. Had quite a big.
Is it Lawrence Llewelyn-Bowen? Is that your ex-husband?
No, but he does look a little bit like him, actually. I think Lawrence Llewelyn-Bowen stole his look from my ex-husband.
That's a very unique UK reference. Apologies for anyone that doesn't know who Lawrence Llewelyn-Bowen is. Google him. You'll love it.
Yes, you'll then know what Jody's ex sort of looks like. And he, so he was, partying quite hard. And the idea was that, well, when you get pregnant, I'll quit.
Stop, yeah.
We were running an interior design business together. We were kind of Z-list celebrities in London. It all got a bit messy.
Okay.
And by the time we were just thinking about maybe doing fertility treatments, I had a nervous breakdown from it all because I was holding the whole show together.
Yeah.
As the very, very well-trained codependent daughter coming from a background full of substance abuse, I kind of was holding the whole show together, the marriage, the business, my infertility, although I never called it infertility. I didn't think of myself as infertile. I was someone who was trying to have a baby. Never even,
Right.
it's just a matter of time. I had a nervous breakdown, and I also realized I couldn't bring a child into the marriage because I looked around me and saw the chaos and thought, I can't do this. And that was the end of my marriage, and I was sort of spat out into the dating world in my very late 30s. I'm quite geeky. I was a very early adopter of internet dating, my friends were all appalled because, who are you going to meet and this, that and the other. But now it's like really normal. It really wasn't normal.
Plentyoffish.com was groundbreaking.
It was, yes. I was on something called Love and Friends, which was also a similar thing to Plenty of Fish. And I did have two sort of quite serious post-divorce relationships. One of them, he didn't want children. One of them did want children, but we never managed to get to the point of trying IVF, and that was lucky because actually it was a very unstable relationship. I later came to understand that there were strong narcissistic elements in it, so it was really quite traumatic for me. Sort of a lot of kind of coercive control and emotional abuse and things going on. So when that finally kind of came to an end, and I know that had I I kind of hung on to things I shouldn't hang on to because they were always my last chance to try IVF and have a baby. And then I reached 44 and a half, that relationship ended. And I realized that even if I did meet someone, we'd need to know each other for at least a year before we could even think about doing IVF. I'd be 45 and a half. And even my kind of cast iron hope / denial couldn't really find a way around that. And I was like, it's over. My childlessness is not sort of a temporary and inconvenient way station on the path to motherhood. This is permanent.
Was there a definitive moment that you remember thinking, and forgive me, did you think I've lost?
Yeah. It was just after that relationship broke up. I'd moved into what London estate agents would call a studio flat, and which in the olden days we used to call them bedsits.
Bedsits.
So a kind of a one-room, pretty grotty apartment that belonged to a friend of a friend, and I was 44 and a half, single, childless, broke, deeply unhappy, wondering how my life had turned out like this. And I was standing at the window. I had a really amazing view of the Westway, which is a very big motorway in London that goes through sort of West London. So yeah, a bedsit overlooking a motorway. I hope I'm painting the picture of how bleak this day was. It was a grey February afternoon, and it was raining, and I was just watching the rain, raindrops down the windows that needed cleaning, finding their way through the dust, feeling very, very bereft. And I just thought, it's over, and it was a moment of like, it's over. I'm never going to be a mother. And it just felt like a whole pack of cards, a whole house of cards that I'd been living in for 15 years just fell down. And I was just left standing there, not really knowing how to take the next step forward in my life. Kind of even if I wanted to.
Yeah. It's kind of out of your hands now, isn't it?
Yeah. But also something extraordinary happened in that moment, which was, it was as if there were two lives I'd been living for a long time. There was the unconscious life where I was sort of psychologically nesting, preparing to become a mother. You know, I can't be in this relationship because of this. I can't be with that guy because of this. I can't be with my husband because, you know, this and that. I can't take this job because it doesn't have maternity leave. I can't start, you know, studying for a new career now because then I'll be you know, I was always factoring in becoming a mother into every single plan. And then there was a life I was actually living, which was a single, childless, middle-aged woman trying to make her way through life. And many of the opportunities that came my way, I didn't take because I felt unconsciously they would get in the way of my chances of being a mum.
How interesting.
And what happened was that these two life paths they came together at this point. There was a sense that my energy unconsciously had been so divided. I was like divided against myself. And they came together. And I felt a real sort of shift in the energy in my body, like right down in my belly, a sort of chunk. And I was present in my life for the first time in a very, very long time. And I started to think, okay, well, you know, when I was 20, I used to look ahead to when I'd be 50, if I ever got that old.
So old.
And I'd think, well, you remember, it's like old is a moving target. Apparently, old is always 20 years older than you are.
Yeah.
So I thought at that point, you know, forgive me the vanity and optimism of youth. I thought I can achieve anything. All I've got to do is put my mind to it. You know, I've always been a grafter. You know, just put my mind to it, work towards it. You know, I can achieve my goals. And I thought, well, in that case, why can't the years from 45 to 75 be like that? And then I had another thought, which was, when was the last time I had a thought like that? When was the last time I had an open-ended kind of thought about life? It had narrowed to this one thing, which was like motherhood or bust.
Or nothing.
Yeah. And now I was at nothing. So, and I'd like to say that there was a kind of, you know, hallelujah moment and I knew what I was going to do and everything was going to be fine. But I'm glad I had that moment of opening, because after that I fell into the most massive pit of grief. But I didn't know it was grief. I just knew it was a deeper... I'd had quite a lot of trauma in my life. I'd overcome a lot of things in my life. But I fell into a pit that I had no idea how to get out of, or even if it was possible to get out of it.
How did you get out of it? How long were you in that pit?
Well, it was 2 years before I discovered that what I was experiencing was grief.
Wow.
So I went to see, because childlessness is a form of disenfranchised grief. So it's a grief that is not socially recognized or acceptable. So that's when I was talking to everyone and no one would let me sort of talk about my childlessness. So I went to see therapists, I went to see doctors, and nobody named what I was experiencing as grief. It was depression. It was a midlife crisis. It was this, it was that, the other, but no one named it as grief. I then started my training to become a psychotherapist, which was something I'd wanted to do many years earlier, but I had decided I needed to be a parent first because I wouldn't understand the human condition until I was a parent. You know, so this internal prejudice that we've been talking about, we internalize it as well. So I believed I wouldn't be a fully sort of adult human until I was a parent. And then I thought, actually, me and the human condition, we know each other quite well. I reckon I'm okay. So I started my training, and it was in my second year, and we were doing a weekend training program on bereavement. And the trainer was explaining the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief model. And I was like totally getting it. Like, wow, this is really resonant. And a little light bulb was going off. And I went home that evening and I mapped out the 5 stages of grief against my experience of childlessness. And I was like, I'm grieving. Holy smoke, I'm grieving. And it was, I've got goosebumps because it was a life-changing moment for me for 2 reasons. Number one, I thought, I don't know how, but I understand that this is a process. And that means one day I'm going to be on the other side of it.
Yeah.
I am not going to feel like this forever. I don't know how to get there, but I know it's possible. So I was in hell with no exit door, and someone they said, okay, the exit door's over there. We can't tell you how to get there, but there is a door out of hell.
Have you got a map at all? No, right. I'm on my own. Right. Okay, great.
But that was the first I knew that there was a door out of here.
Right.
So, and then the second thing is like, I'm not going mad, because the experience of grief is cognitively so confusing. It's like living in a hall of mirrors. You have the most random, insane thought processes that can be quite disturbing. Your personality undergoes a massive change, all of your friendships. There is nothing in your life that is not touched by the process of grieving. It's like complete wholesale transformation, and not a kind of Instagram sort of, lovely la 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 transformation. Just like your whole life goes to shit and you have no idea what's going on. That's what grief really feels like. No one really wants to kind of talk about it, but it's like, and someone said, like you said, we're not going to tell you where the map is, but there is one. I was like, and that was really the moment for me. When I started, I think it was actually just after I'd started my blog, or I started my blog just after that weekend, and I became a grief junkie. I started reading everything I could about grief, and I'm a writer and my background is kind of English literature, and I started reading very, very widely in the grief literature, and just this sense that this was such a fundamental human experience, and that right back to the ancient Greeks and right back to the Vedics, as far as you can go back in written human history, people have been writing about grief. It is such a universal experience, and that gave me great comfort.
Yeah.
That I was not sort of experiencing this kind of sort of mental meltdown, but that actually what I was going through was something fundamentally human. And yet I still wasn't allowed to talk about it. And when I'd say to people I'm grieving, they say, but you haven't lost anything.
Yeah.
How can you be, no, you're not. How can you be grieving?
Yeah.
You haven't lost anything. And I'd be like, well, if you'd like to spend an afternoon on the inside of my head and my heart and then tell me that this isn't grief, maybe then. And I became very passionate about it, very passionate about helping people understand grief and also supporting women through grief. And I started to create I was giving talks and writing blogs, and women were saying, you seem to understand this in a way that no one else does. Can you do something? Can you support us? Can you create? And I was like, well, I'll give it a go.
Yeah.
I'd had a lot of experience in 12-step groups. Particularly after my marriage broke down, I was part of a group called Al-Anon, which is for friends and families of addicts and alcoholics.
Okay.
And I had got so much support and learnt so much in those rooms with other people who'd been through so many similar experiences to me. And I'd heard what it's like to sit in a room and hear someone share a different story, but there's so much in it I resonated with.
Yeah.
And I began to understand the power of peer-to-peer healing.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, I don't need to be an expert. I don't need to have all the answers. If I can bring childless women together in a safe space with good boundaries, with a clear structure about how we're going to sort of support each other in this time and confidentiality, maybe the same thing would happen. And it did. You know, those first Gateway Women groups, and then I turned what I learnt from running those groups into a workshop called the Reignite Weekend, which is still running. It's now runs in Australia and New Zealand, in North America, in Canada, in the UK and Europe. I've got a team of trained facilitators who lead that weekend. Wow. And that weekend transforms lives. And I wrote my book, and I've become, like, as we say, the grief lady. The childless grief lady. You're that grief relief podcast. I'm that childless grief lady.
Well, I know what your Instagram handle should be. It's quite phenomenal. You have a phenomenal story, because, as I say, and as we spoke about, I didn't know your story. I've looked at your Instagram, but I don't look at Instagram accounts of my guests in great detail, because I want the first time for us to have this conversation as you would like to think you could do if I were to meet you in a coffee shop. right? But as you say,
Mm.
and especially women to women, and I think even I think I have to admit, I think probably even in my space of being voluntary childless, if I did meet someone like you and you said, and you briefly touched on your story, I don't know how. Okay, so
Mm.
how do I react? What do I do? Normally I make a joke, but I can't make a joke because it's
Yeah.
so it's what you're doing, and I'm not here to blow your trumpet, but I just think what you're doing is fantastic, because these women clearly, especially the first women that told you about this, that these women needed someone, and they clearly needed you, and it didn't, no disrespect, it didn't have to be you, it could have been someone else.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't, it was you, and you've brought these women together, and for
Mm.
them, as you say, to be able to speak openly and safely, I think is the a real key word as well. The
There's a
women
lot of
in your
shame. There's a lot of shame around childlessness.
yeah
So, still, which is incredibly sad, it takes a lot for a childless woman to open up, a lot. And we are so used to being shut down that we very rarely share our stories unless we know that it's a safe place to do so, which is why a lot of people presume that childless women in their lives are child free, because they don't talk about their pain
no
and they hide it
yeah
because they're tired of having it diminished and dismissed.
mm.
And so people presume they're more okay with it than they are.
Yeah, and I think as well, you could also how do I verbalize what I'm trying to say here? You could almost then, you don't want to then turn into that you're preaching to people, well, actually you should be educated about this, and it's not uncommon, and childlessness
Mm.
is a big thing. But at what stage do you sort of go, well, actually, as you said earlier with your standard answers, you want to educate people, but you don't want to come across as preaching.
You
But
have
this
to
is a
pick your moment. Not
yeah
every moment is a teaching moment.
yeah I do
I
need to
find,
I know I need to learn that myself, ironically.
yeah, I mean, I also, I'm not always in the mood.
No.
I was not put on this earth solely to, educate everyone about childlessness. And if it wasn't my work, if it wasn't my life's work, it chose me. Childlessness chose me in so many ways. I don't think about it much anymore. Because that's the extraordinary gift of grief, is that my personality and my life has been transformed into one where my children live in my heart.
Yeah.
But the love for my children, which is what created the grief I went through, has now been integrated into who I am. I mean, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's like, hello, my name is Jody and I'm childless. And my childlessness was there. It was the most important thing you needed to know about me. And now my childlessness is part of the context of who Jody is.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jody. I'm a writer. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm a partner. I'm a dog mum. I'm a new country dweller. I'm a daughter. I'm a friend.
Yeah.
I'm childless.
I'm
I am many
childless.
things. I am childless, but I am so much more. That is the transformational gift of grief. Is integrated it into me. So I don't necessarily want to talk about my childlessness anymore. And something really bizarre, I really noticed as I got to a place of peace and integration with my childlessness, and maybe also being slightly older, people stopped asking me. People stopped asking me whether I had children or about my childlessness or why not. It was like when I was like, I'm ready now. Come on, world, ask me.
How funny.
People
And
had
how did
stopped.
you feel about that?
Well, it took me a while to notice it. And also for those years that I'm now in a happy partnership again. I've been with my partner for sort of nearly 5 years, but I spent a long period of my 40s single, and to be honest, I don't think I met a lot of people during that period, because being single and childless and in your sort of late 40s, I mean, I used to joke, but it wasn't always a joke, that the only invitations I got were to dental checkups. You do become like sort of social plankton, I'm afraid. And also, self-employed, working from home, It wasn't a very sort of social period of my life. So I guess I wasn't maybe meeting as many people. But when I met my partner at 52 and started meeting more people through him again, I just noticed it wasn't such a, people I'd never met before, so they didn't know anything about my story. I just noticed I wasn't being asked.
How funny.
Yeah.
That must have been quite, I mean, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but was it a relief or was it?
Oh, massively.
Yeah.
Because I spend a lot of my time thinking, writing and talking about childlessness. It was quite nice to, to not be seen for that. I have a red jacket that I wear that's on the back cover of my book, and I wore it when I gave my TED talk, and it was the very first press photo of me was in that red leather jacket, and so people really know me for that red leather jacket.
Okay.
And I called the version of Jody who talks about childlessness, I called her Red Jacket Jody.
Okay.
I kind of put her on for public appearances.
Yeah.
And then I take her off, because that is not the most important thing about my identity anymore. And it's, I guess I'm just a natural campaigner and advocate. One of the reasons I've stayed talking about it, even though I don't need to talk about it anymore, is because I don't want there to be nothing there for the next generation of childless women. Those young women who could have been our daughters, I don't want there to be nothing for them. And I don't want them to go through this experience in the same cultural background as I did. Because the extraordinary thing is the work that I've done and the work that Gateway Women done has changed the conversation.
Yeah.
And people sort of look to the UK as the pioneers in the world for kind of more advanced thinking and talk and programs for childless women. And most of them have arisen out of my work. They've been people who've been part of the Gateway Women community and have gone on to do other things, or have trained as childless therapists, or have, started to talk about it in their art or in their work or in their writing. So much of it, I was at the Barbican a few years ago for More to Life Than Children, which was a one-day event, which was part of Fertility Fest. And it was kind of including childlessness in the story of fertility. Very important.
Yeah.
A festival that Jessica Hepburn created. And the people on stage, that's a big shift as well. I wasn't speaking, I was chairing the day.
Oh, funny, yeah.
And almost everyone who was performing that day, so poets, artists, songwriters, campaigners, speakers, almost every single one name-checked either my book or knowing me personally or the transformation they've been through being part of the work that I do. And I didn't even know some of these people. And I was thinking, okay, I really might have to accept that I have actually done something.
Good for you.
Because I find, because as you said before, it could have been someone else. But childlessness and being a childless campaigner chose me.
Yeah. And I think that's great. And I love the fact that you are, that you can acknowledge. I mean, that's certainly something that not a lot of people can do, especially women, is actually
It's really
credit
hard.
Yeah,
really
credit
hard.
themselves. Yeah, for
and
sure.
I feel a little bit ashamed for doing it live on camera. You know what I mean? Because there's part of me, don't get too big for your boots.
No, exactly. No, you have, well, I'm here to tell you, you've done good things, and there are clearly thousands of women around the world, and men as well, that would say the same thing. So yeah, damn right, as you should. Get that red jacket on and just kind of like Beyonce your way around life. And how are you today, Jody?
Fantastic. Yeah. In many ways, I feel what is known in the literature as adapted child-free, which is I feel quite child-free. I don't feel there's anything missing from my life that I don't have children. I don't feel any less than a woman who is a mother. I also no longer feel less than the version of me who would have been a mother.
Right.
It's like I no longer see the life I'm living as the booby prize life, where you didn't get to be a mum, but this is what you're doing instead.
Yeah.
It's like that life, being a mum, would have been a messy, imperfect human experience. The one I'm living as childless is a messy, imperfect human experience. They have equal value. They are different lives, they have equal value. So I don't spend any time sort of wondering what ifs anymore. Mm-hmm. The grief dealt with all the what ifs. And I call myself childless because I do want to acknowledge the path that it took to become who I am today, and also out of respect to my child-free sisters, whose internal experience is very different and often doesn't involve grief. You know, it's not a kind of straightforward, oh, I'm child-free, I don't want to have kids, yay. You know, it's often also a lot more complicated, and it's a decision that gets revisited many times and comes under a lot of cultural pressure to keep making sure. And, you know, you're now turning 40. You know, over the next few years, you may see that pressure intensify as people see you as in your sort of last chance saloon.
Oh yeah, I mean it's very interesting you saying about the different stages, because I've always known I didn't want children. I never played with dolls. I used to like cut Barbie's hair off and set fire to it and stuff. I was a very strange child. But then when my mum died quite suddenly in 2010, she died of a heart attack, and so was very sudden. So what she had in her handbag is what she carried with her every day, right? And in her handbag was a small photo album with pictures of random things, you know, like a work photo shoot that we did for our like company website that I'd email her, that she printed out on A4 paper and put into, you know. And I remember looking at it and thinking, this might sound strange. I'm thinking, wow, she really loved us. Like,
Yeah.
and then I thought, wow, should I, you know, am I doing this wrong? Am I being selfish, not having children? And should I think about this? And at the time I just met my now husband, now separated. And so it was too early to have a conversation with him and what have you. So that I inquired about freezing eggs. And then I only thought about that for about a year. Then when my dad passed away shortly after that, I thought, oh God, do I need to have children? Like, is this what's going on? Because my brother had just become a father for the first time. And anyway, my point is it's so interesting that you've touched on the fact that it does resurface. I don't just walk around every day going, no, I don't want kids. But certainly as I've actually just passed 40, but as I've gotten older, it's becoming more certain to me that I don't want children. More and more solidified. It always has been, but it's more solidified. And I think you're right in terms of, I think perhaps I've matured in the way that I reply to people. And again, especially in this region, because before I'd be like, don't want them, not interested, quite disrespectfully to people, perhaps like yourself, people that have lost children or different situations. You know, I was just bouncing through life going, oh no, definitely not, like little shits, not, you know, I'm not interested at all. Not for the life of me thinking about other people's sensitivities. So another reason why I love doing this podcast, because it, you know, if we can all educate each other and to do positive things, and happy days.
I didn't really understand the child-free choice, and I was quite negative towards it, particularly when people would presume that in those early days of my grief that I had chosen not to have children, because I was prejudiced. I thought that, you know, I don't want people to think I didn't want children, because I had carried the belief, which is a cultural belief that I had internalized, that child-free women didn't like children, that they were somehow unnatural women. I didn't want to be one of them. And then as I started to really look for literature to support me, I found that the only women who really had written about the child wish and not wanting to have children and wanting to have children were child-free women. So I started reading a lot of child-free literature, and I started to realize that actually the cultural idea of a child-free woman, and that I had internalized, which was wholly negative, didn't match the lived experience of women who'd chosen not to have children. And also, although some of them had not experienced grief, some of them had become child-free after, perhaps a pregnancy that was unplanned, that then ended in a miscarriage, and they grieved. Or there can have been, there can be grief and kind of letting down important people in your life. Maybe they were under a lot of pressure in their families and things like that to have children. There were just as many complex ways to be child-free and internal stories about being child-free. And that's when I realized I've been sold a complete lie again about what this experience is about. And the book I think that really, really blew my eyes open was Megan Dorm's collection of essay called Selfish, Shallow and Self-Absorbed.
16 I think that's my autobiography.
Yeah, 16 writers on the choice not to have children. It is a fantastic collection of essays which really cover, from men and women who are writers, on their journey to being child free. And that's when I found how diverse it was, and also how some of them were similar to becoming childless and some of them were very different. But there wasn't this kind of one story.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. You've recommended a book, but as you know, I always ask for an Instagram or a podcast. It doesn't need to be related, but what do you have for me?
Well, I think the podcast that I would recommend is called the Full Stop Podcast.
Okay.
And it is amazing because it's a podcast for the childless, not by choice community. And it is 3 amazing people, rarely in the childless world, 1 man and two women.
Wow.
The 2 women I know very well. They've both sort of been through their childless journeys with Gateway Women, and I've got to know them both very well. And so just search the Full Stop Podcast. They're on Instagram, and they're also on most podcast platforms. It's amazing because they invite so many different people, men and women, and it's a very jokey one. I left a review once that the way they record it is it sounds like you're just walking past a table in a pub.
Brilliant.
And there's this really interesting conversation going on at that table, and you just find yourself gradually kind of drawn towards it, overhearing it, and then they say, oh look, why don't you pull up a chair? It's very kind of friendly, it's not preachy, it tackles a lot of very difficult taboo topics in just such a relatable way, and it really deserves a bigger audience.
Brilliant. Okay, the Full Stop Podcast. I love it. Yeah. And what a wonderful review as well, because I think that's what everybody wants from a podcast or a radio show, is that you're welcoming in a friend to join the conversation. So Jody, thank you so much for taking the time. I really, really appreciate it, and everything obviously you've done for the community and talking about your story in such depth. And if it wasn't for people like you sharing your story, and as something we always say on the podcast is that hopefully even if just one person hears this and hears your story and it helps them, then that's the best thing as well. And in saying that, of course, is that if you've been affected by anything that you've heard today, please feel free to reach out. I'm not a professional. Jody is very much a professional and an expert. I'll put all the links below in the episode notes, but feel free to reach out. I can point you in the right directions, or reach out directly to Jody, and she can as well. And we'll just go from there. Or certainly if we can help in any way, that is what we are here for. So Jody, thank you so much for everything, and I will speak to you very soon, I hope.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you for making space for grief in our society. I think the more of us that understand grief and understand that grief is actually a form of love, and it transforms us and it heals us, it's nothing to be afraid of. So Thank you for making space for grief.
Yeah, it can be scary, but it's nothing to be afraid of, especially do it together. That's what I like.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jody. Lots of love. I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.